Dune is finally out. I've been excited for this movie ever since it was announced because not only does it have an insanely stacked cast, but it's from my favorite filmmaker to really break through and emerge in the last decade, Denis Villenueve, and I have to say, this movie is incredible. Obviously, there was so much hype going into this movie, and when it was released and all the critics saying masterpiece, that puts the movie already up here for expectations, but I gotta say, I walked out really satisfied. Are there problems? Yes. Do I think this is a masterpiece? No. I know a lot of people do, and I can understand it for the most part, but there's one thing about the movie that I feel like people should know going into it, and we're just going to jump straight into this review. I don't even want to try to explain the plot because it's so difficult to explain. You kind of just have to read it or watch the movie or the old movie or the book. Mind you, I have not read the book that obviously this comes from or seen the David Lynch movie from '84, I'm pretty sure, and I did that on purpose because I wanted to go into this movie completely blind. I didn't want to know what happened at all in the story, and really, when you go into a movie like this that has so much lore and such a massive world, I mean, the scale of the movie is insane, but just so much lore in it, I think that's the best way to describe it. There's a lot to unpack in the movie, and I think for the most part, it does a good job. But going back to what I was saying before, the one thing that people have to realize going into this movie is this is Dune Part 1. Now, that's one thing that I will say, the marketing failed at, to be completely honest. Now, I totally understand why they didn't do that. I understand that if you just advertise it as one movie, it makes sense, but in the first 10 minutes, whenever the credits start rolling, you see the title card, it says Dune Part 1, so it totally makes sense. So a lot of people will walk out of this movie feeling disappointed in a way because it's not what they expected, and I feel like my expectations changed a little bit when I heard that it was only Part 1, and I suggest doing that going into the movie. Now, because this is Part 1, yes, there isn't too much finality with the story. I think that's how I'm supposed to say it, and yeah, you do have to expect that going into it, but I will say there were multiple times while I was watching the movie where I was like, oh no, it's gonna end. Oh no, it's gonna end. Oh no, it's gonna end. It was all in like the last probably 20-30 minutes because this movie's quite long, and I felt the runtime, but I'm not exactly complaining because I was loving basically everything I was seeing on screen. But there were definitely times towards the end where I was like, oh no, it's gonna end. Oh no, it's gonna end. And I just kept feeling like it was just gonna stop and leave us on a cliffhanger. And I think the spot they chose to end it at was smart, although now that Part 2 is not greenlit from the studios, that worries me a little bit. It's not 100% confirmed that Part 2 will come out, so that worries me a little bit. And I do think that this movie could go up to that masterpiece status once we get Part 2 and you can watch them back to back. But I mentioned the stack cast before, so let's talk about it. It stars Timothee Chalamet as Paul, and Timothee Chalamet is obviously one of the biggest actors right now, and he is fantastic in this movie. I think this is easily one of his best performances because as Paul, he's a very interesting character because, he's the, this not stereotypical, but like the typical character that, same thing, is like the son, the next one, like the Simba, kind of, that's the first thing that came to my mind, the one that is going to rule everything next after his father, and he plays that, and you see it in the trailers where he's like, what if I'm not the one to do it next? And I think that the way he plays that conflicted guy is so well done, and in his visions featuring Zendaya, as you've all seen in the trailer, I think that the way they're handled is so well, and also there's some certain trick, I'll call it, I don't want to say what it is, but if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about, that Rebecca Ferguson, his mother, and him kind of practice, I'll say. I think this is the most I can say about it. You know what I mean if you've seen the movie, but there's something in the way that's handled, especially with the sound design as well, is so well done. And Rebecca Ferguson also is amazing. She's probably one of my favorite actors working today, actors, actresses, whatever you want to say. And to be completely honest, I think the actor that stood out to me most was actually Oscar Isaac as Paul's father and all this. Like, he is, he's like the ruler of their house. And yes, as I said before, there's a ton of lore and there's all these houses, House of Atreides, House of this, and like all these different people, and explaining it is a little confusing. And I will say there were definitely times, I think within that first act, maybe even going into the second, where I was a little bit confused of what was going on because there's so much. But just wait. There was one part in the movie where everything just clicked. I'm not going to say what it is because obviously it's a very big spoiler, but there's something that happens, and then for me, everything totally made sense in the past. So I think that was just me, and because it was a later showing, I saw it like 9:30, 10 at night. So normally I see them at like 7. So maybe that was part of it. And it was a good theater experience as well because the theater was really packed. Like, I think that now in Ontario, like, if it's a fully vaccinated place, like, you have to show proof of vaccine, whatever, and it can be like 100% capacity. So I think the theater was, because there are people all around, and just seeing it with that crowd was fun. Even though, you know, in Canada here, very different from the States, I've talked about this a few times, the reactions aren't as big. There were definitely times where just seeing it with a bunch of people around me really helped the experience. And you have to see this movie in the theater. I know that it came out on HBO Max either today or yesterday. I saw it last night, obviously. Today is Saturday. It's the day it's coming out. And I know it came out there, and some people will be like, oh yeah, I'll just watch it at home. No, you have to see this one in the theater. I think that Denis Villeneuve's movies should definitely always be seen first in the theater. And that's coming from someone who's only seen one of his movies, Dune, in theaters, because Prisoners is my favorite film from him. I didn't see this until like 2019, and I wish I saw it in theaters, especially Blade Runner 2049, his last film, another one of my favorites of all time, the best looking movie of all time, and I really wish I could have seen that in theaters. That would have blew my mind. And this film was also on the same visual level as Prisoners, and especially Blade Runner 2049. It is one of the most visually stunning films of all time. I know I've talked about like my experience with it and expectations in this review, and yes, this review will be longer, but the movie is absolutely gorgeous. Denis Villeneuve really knows how to direct a film with a grand scale. Although this is only part 1 in the whole Dune story, you still feel the sense of realism that I really, really loved, and there are so many great sequences that are just like, it's from a character's perspective of them looking down on something. Obviously, the one big thing that everyone remembers from Dune, whether you've read the book, seen the 1984 movie, I think, or this one, is the sandworm. And there's one scene, it was the first sandworm spotting, and you see, I think, Josh Brolin and Timothée Chalamet kind of like, they're on a plane with a bunch of other people, but they're standing on like the little dock and they look down, and it's just the shot and how it's filmed that really shows the size and the danger and stuff like that. There's that in so many scenes. There's a ton of action sequences that really use that to their advantage. This movie is not some big action spectacle. It is a character film. It is totally based around all these characters, and that's why I think it really worked. And yes, as I said before, I did have problems with it, and again, some of it goes to the marketing. It's because this film is marketed as some big action blockbuster, and once again, I totally understand, because that's how you draw in audiences. But when you go into it knowing that it is a character-based film, I feel like you will walk out of it more satisfied. We spend a ton of time with Paul, and it totally works. As I said, all the performances are great. Josh Brolin is also amazing. Jason Momoa was so good in this movie. It was weird seeing him without facial hair for the most part, but he had some of the most badass scenes, I think, probably ever in this scene. He actually had my favorite scene in this entire film, so that's pretty cool. There are certain people that aren't in this film as much as you'd expect, but I'm not going to say who they are because I've seen some reviews and people have said that, but I didn't watch any reviews until after I watched the movie. I saw like ratings and stuff, but I'm glad I didn't, because there are certain big name people, I'll say, that aren't in the movie as much as you'd expect, and I think it's better to not know that going into it. I highly recommend seeing Dune on the biggest screen with the loudest surround sound, because Hans Zimmer's score just blows your mind. It's this very deep score. I can't remember if he did Blade Runner 2049. I think he did. I'm not 100% sure. Obviously, he's like probably the best film scorer of all time, or film, composer, you know what I mean? And once again, he outdoes himself with Dune. I think that this is easily one of his best in later years. It is just so fantastic, and it adds to the sequences so much, because as I said, it's a super grand film. I think that's obvious from the trailers. That's been obvious since day one when it was announced, and everyone knows about Dune. Even if you have no idea what happens in it, you've probably heard the name Dune before when talking about the book, especially because it's like the biggest sci-fi book of all time or something. And again, I haven't read it, but the score goes so well with so many scenes. I was very happy walking out of Dune. It was very different from what I was expecting, and I think it might be my favorite of the year, although I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm very excited for part 2 when it comes out in 6 years or whatever. Hopefully a studio greenlights it soon. Dune is a masterful, groundbreaking film that once again shows Denis Villeneuve's talent behind the camera. Chalamet, Ferguson, Brolin, Momoa, and Isaac all shine here. I can't quite call this a masterpiece yet, since this is only part 1, but I was completely immersed in this film the whole time. I'm gonna give Dune a 4.5 out of 5. Obviously, that's a very, very high score, and I really did love this movie. And I feel like a lot of people will attack me in the comments saying, oh, why'd you give it such a high score if you had problems with it? In reality, I only really had like 2 or 3 problems with it, but I felt like I had to go into it here, and I don't think I'll do a spoiler video, at least yet. I would really like to talk about this movie more, but I'm only going to see it once in theaters, just because I really don't have the time for it. I'm very excited for part 2 when it eventually comes out. I really hope that this film does well enough to greenlight that part 2. I know that it kind of all depends on how well this movie does in theaters, because, you know, HBO Max, it'll do well, I assume. I don't know, I'm in Canada, we don't have it, but you have to see this movie in theaters. It is a masterful film. I said that in my quick little thing there that I do before my score, you know what I mean, like the wrap-up thing, and I just think that that's the best word to describe it. Masterful. Dune is fantastic, and if you've seen it, let me know what you thought of it down below, and thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Over and out.